MySQL enumeration. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how to enumerate as much information as possible from a MySQL database server with or by taking advantage of various auxiliary modules afforded to us by the Metasploit framework. So first and foremost, what is MySQL? Well, MySQL is essentially an open source relational database management system that's based on SQL. SQL means the structured query language and is typically used to store records like customer data and various other types of data associated with the operations of a company. There are various deployment use cases for MySQL, or rather any other type of relational database management system, but MySQL is typically or commonly deployed to store web application data. So if you're setting up a web application like WordPress requires a database to store data, and as a result, you can either use MySQL or any other type of relational database management system to store your data. So you'll typically find MySQL deployed as a database to store the web application data. And again, given that that is the fact, exploiting or performing enumeration on a MySQL database server can be vital in a penetration test. And again, it really is very, very important, and you need to take it into consideration whenever you're performing information gathering. Now, MySQL utilizes TCP port 3306 by default. However, like any other service, it can be hosted or configured to run on any other open TCP port, which is something that companies or organizations have started doing in order to avoid attacks on their database server. So they'll typically change the MySQL port from 3306 to something else in a way, or rather as a technique to avoid detection. However, this again is not really helpful because we can perform a full port scan and discover the port that actually has MySQL running on it. Now, we can utilize various auxiliary modules to enumerate information like the version of MySQL that's running, and that information can be pertinent to exploitation. We can also utilize auxiliary modules to perform brute force attacks on the MySQL database server. So we can again perform these brute force attacks to identify usernames and passwords and legitimate credentials that we can authenticate with, which will consequently give us access to the database server. After we've gained access to a database server, or after we have credentials to a database server, we can use various other auxiliary modules to essentially enumerate information from the database server, like the tables or the databases, as well as execute various SQL queries, which we will be exploring within the lab environment. So let's actually switch over to the lab environment now. All right, so I am currently within the lab environment, and the first thing we want to do is, of course, identify the target IP address, which we can do by typing in ifconfig, and we're looking for the interface Ethernet 1, and of course we identify our IP address here, so that is 192.143.6.2, which means that the target IP address will be 193.143.6.3, and in your case, again, all you need to do is just change the 2 to a 3, and that's the target IP address. So I'm just going to copy that. We then want to start up the PostgreSQL database server. So PostgreSQL service PostgreSQL start, that should start it up for us. So give that a few seconds. MSF console to start up the Metasploit framework console. Give that a few seconds. All right, the next thing we want to do is add a workspace. So I'm going to say workspace add, and we'll just call this MySQL_enum, right? And we'll hit enter, and that's currently our workspace. The next thing we want to do to avoid any inconvenience of setting or actually constantly looking up the target IP is to set up the global variable for the rhosts variable. So we're going to set that up, and we're going to again paste in the target IP, change the 2 into a 3, and we'll also do this for the rhost variable in addition to rhosts. So again, just hit enter, and that again should prevent us, or again will actually save us from typing in the target IP every time we want to use a module. All right, so let's get started. Now, when it comes down to MySQL enumeration and exploitation, the first thing that we need to do is identify the version of MySQL that's running. So we can run a search for the auxiliary modules pertinent to MySQL by typing in search, and then we can specify or use the type filter to limit the results to auxiliary modules. And then we can enter a name, which again, in this case, we will type in MySQL and hit enter. And as you can see, we have quite a few modules. The one we're starting off with is the MySQL version module, which I'll just copy here, and we will say use. We're going to then hit enter. There we are. So it's loaded and active. We're now going to show the options for this particular module. And as you can see, the options are fairly simple. We need to provide the target IP, which is done through the global variable that we just set. You then have the rport option, which is the port that MySQL is running on the target. And in this case, it is running on port 3306. We can, of course, confirm that we can actually confirm this by performing a port scan. So again, if I just search for port scan, and we use the default TCP port scan module as we did during the port scanning video, we can then again show the options here and then just hit run because the target IP has been specified. And once we hit run, you should see that the open port is port 3306, as you can see. So that is the port that is actually hosting the MySQL database server. So now that we know or have confirmed that that is the case, we can now use the MySQL module, MySQL version. So we're going to hit enter again, and again we just show the options here. So we have everything configured, and we can now hit run to enumerate the version of MySQL running on the target. And in this case, you can see it says that the target is running MySQL version 5.5.61, and we can also get the version of Ubuntu running, which in this case, it actually tells us that the target is running Ubuntu 14.04. So we've been able to get the version of MySQL and the distribution that's currently running, which in this case is Ubuntu 14.04. This information can be very useful during the exploitation and post-exploitation phases. So again, it is all very pertinent. Now, when it comes down to further enumeration of MySQL, we actually need some access to the database server. And in order to obtain that access, we can either find an exploit for this version of MySQL. However, there isn't any active exploit that can allow us to, again, target this version. So what we'll need to do is perform a brute force in order to see or identify whether we can find any legitimate credentials that can provide us with some form of access to the MySQL database server. The module we can use to do that is one called MySQL login. So I'm just going to search for it. And that's the module there. So it's the MySQL login utility, and similar to the FTP, SMB, and the web server enumeration videos, this can allow, or this can be used to perform a brute force. So again, we'll just show the options here. And the options that we need to set are, number one, the brute force speed, which is currently set to the highest. We also need to configure the target IP, which is done, and the target port. We then can specify the username and the user file, etc., all the information pertinent to a brute force attack. Now, when we talk about MySQL and the credentials that we're pretty much going to be after, that is going to be the root credentials, right? Because the root user on any system essentially has all privileges. And so instead of performing a brute force for usernames, we can automatically set the username to root and then try and see whether we can find any passwords for the root user. So I'm going to set the username value to root. And we are then going to set the password list or rather the password file to the following word list. So we will utilize, so let's set a pass file here, and we are going to use the Metasploit framework word list. So user share Metasploit framework, and under data and word lists, we are looking for Unix passwords.txt, and we hit enter. We can also disable verbosity or set it to false to only again print out the successful attempts, and we can also specify the stop on success legitimate credentials. So we will set the verbose option to false, and of course this is a Boolean value. And once we're ready to go, all we need